What if I told you the United States Senate already crossed the exact number everyone said was mathematically impossible and almost nobody outside Washington noticed? Before we get into what actually happened that night, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this story ends, because it isn't over. Like if you think, Senate, procedure deserves plain, honest explanation instead of shouting matches. And send this to someone who still thinks a single vote in Washington can't change how their own ballot gets counted, because this one might. This is one of those stories where the actual nobody outside Washington interesting than the exaggerated version. Before we get into what actually happened, the time to slow down and subscribe so you don't miss how this story ends. Why? Because it isn't no dramatic music required. Like if you think just Senate chamber, a procedure deserves plain, honest explanation instead of shouting matches. Finally moving for the first time. And send this to someone who still thinks. By the end of this video, and send this to someone who still thinks a single vote in Washington can't actually watch their own ballot gets counted, because this one instead of just another headline claiming the fight is either completely finished or completely dead. Let's start with the number itself, because the number is real, and it matters. For most of this year, the SAVE Act sat in the Senate looking completely stuck. Republicans hold 53 seats. Passing most legislation the normal way requires 60 votes to end debate, a threshold known as cloture. Every Democrat opposed this bill, and 4 Republicans joined them. That combination made the math look hopeless. 53 minus the defectors put supporters nowhere close to 60. And for months, that arithmetic held firm through vote after vote. Think about how long that particular story held up in Washington. Month after month, reporters covering the Senate described this bill using the same handful of words. Stalled, dead on arrival, going nowhere. Those words weren't wrong exactly. They accurately described the math at the time. But math built on a fixed number of defectors only holds as long as every one of those defectors keeps voting the exact same way every single time on every version of the bill that comes to the floor. That's a much more fragile kind of certainty than it sounds like from the outside. Then, late on the night of June 5th, during a marathon amendment session tied to a budget package, something shifted. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, one of the 4 Republican holdouts, switched her position on a stripped-down version of the bill offered by Senator Mike Lee. That flip pushed the yes count to 50. With Vice President J.D. Vance available to break a tie in the Senate, 50 votes. Plus, the Vice President technically adds up to a majority of the chamber. For the first time, a documented majority of senators had gone on record supporting the core of this legislation. Here's the part that gets lost in the noise, though, and it's important. That particular vote wasn't a simple majority vote on final passage. It was a motion tied to budget rules, and under those rules, it actually needed 60 votes, 3/5 of the Senate, to succeed. It got 50. So even though the headline number, 50 votes, was real and historic and almost nobody outside Washington the motion itself was still recorded. Before we get into what actually happened that night, the bill did not subscribe so you don't miss how this story ends. The president's desk over. What changed was something more symbolic, but still procedure deserves plain, honest explanation instead of shouting in this fight. That a majority of senators were willing to say yes to this bill in some form. Can't change how their own ballot gets counted because symbolic milestone and an actual legislative outcome and matters to nobody outside Washington noticed. Exactly the kind of nuance. Before we get into what actually happened that night, into a punchier, less accurate headline the moment a story like this starts spreading. A vote count moving from 48 to 50 is genuinely newsworthy. It is not, by itself, the same thing as a bill becoming law, and treating those two things as interchangeable is where a lot of the confusion around this story actually comes from. I want to slow down here, because understanding why that distinction matters requires understanding the tool that's been blocking this bill in the first place. Most people know the word filibuster. Fewer people understand how strange and quiet it has become. Rewind to 1957. Senator Strom Thurmond stood on the Senate floor and spoke for more than 24 consecutive hours, the longest individual speech in Senate history, in an effort to block a civil rights bill by refusing to give up the floor. That was the filibuster in its original form. It required stamina. It was visible. The entire country could watch a senator physically hold the floor for as long as their voice and legs would allow. Picture what that actually looked like in practice. A senator standing at a podium for an entire day and night, reading from phone books, cookbooks, anything at all, simply to keep talking and avoid yielding the floor. Colleagues rotating in and out of the chamber to witness it. Reporters camped outside waiting for updates. It was theater, yes, but it was theater with a real physical cost attached. And that cost is exactly what made the tool rare and dramatic rather than routine. In the 1970s, the Senate changed its own rules and quietly broke that visible, physical version of the filibuster. Lawmakers adopted what's often called a two-track system, which let the chamber set aside a blocked bill and move on to other business instead of grinding to a halt. From that point forward, blocking legislation no longer required standing on your feet for hours. It just required declaring your intent to filibuster and letting procedure do the rest. Supporters of tighter voting rules have taken to calling what remains of the filibuster a kind of zombie, still functioning, still killing bills, but without any of the visible effort that once made it costly to use. It's worth remembering that the 60-vote threshold isn't some untouchable constitutional rule. It's a Senate custom, and it has already been weakened twice in modern history. In 2013, Senate Democrats, under Harry Reid, eliminated the filibuster for most presidential nominations. 4 years later, Senate Republicans, under Mitch McConnell, extended that same change to Supreme Court nominees, clearing the way to confirm Neil Gorsuch. Both parties have altered this so-called sacred rule when it served their own immediate goals. That history matters, because the same senator now defending the 60-vote threshold on this particular bill was one of the people who helped dismantle it for something else entirely. Neither party has ever treated the filibuster as truly untouchable when a big enough prize sat on the other side of removing it. That's not a criticism aimed at one side more than the other. It's simply the accurate historical record. And it's exactly why arguments today about preserving the rule on principle tend to draw their own immediate goals from across the political spectrum. That history matters. Both parties have shown a willingness. The same senator now defending the 60-vote threshold on this squarely in the way of was one of the people who helped dismantle it for something else this bill actually do. Neither party has ever treated the filibuster as truly untouchable. It would require anyone registering to vote on a federal election to appear in person. That's not a criticism aimed at one side more than the other. It's simply the accurate historical record, birth certificate, and it's exactly why arguments today about preserving the rule also require voters to show photo identification at the polls. And critically, the version pushed hardest by supporters would take effect immediately upon passage, meaning it could apply to this November's midterm elections rather than being phased in gradually. Each of those three pieces carries its own weight in this debate. The photo identification requirement is the least controversial of the three, since a majority of states already require some form of ID at the polls in one way or another. The documentary proof of citizenship requirement is where most of the disagreement concentrates, because, unlike a driver's license, not everyone keeps a birth certificate or passport easily accessible, and researchers who study this issue estimate that tens of millions of eligible citizens don't have one of those specific documents readily on hand. And the immediate implementation timeline is arguably the most consequential detail of all, because it removes the kind of gradual phase-in period that election administrators typically ask for whenever voting rules change, giving states and voters very little runway to adjust before ballots start getting cast. The House has already passed versions of this bill more than once, first in the spring of last year, then again this year under a renamed adjusted version after the first attempt stalled completely in the Senate. Twice approved by the House, twice delivered to the Senate, and twice it sat there, blocked by the same wall of opposition. If you're finding this clearer than the shouting matches you usually see on this topic, drop a comment telling me one thing about Senate procedure you didn't fully understand before this video, because that tells me exactly what. To explain better next time, let's talk honestly about why 4 Republicans blocked their own party's top legislative priority, because their reasons aren't identical, and lumping them together misses the real story. Mitch McConnell, who chairs the Senate Rules Committee, has argued publicly that building this kind of federal election infrastructure creates a tool that could eventually be used by whichever party controls Washington, not just the one that builds it first. His concern is rooted in a basic principle of American federalism. Elections have traditionally been run by states, and centralizing that authority carries risks regardless of who's currently in charge. That argument is worth sitting with for a moment because it's not really about this specific bill at all. It's about a broader pattern in how power tends to work in Washington over time. Any structure built to give the federal government more control over how elections run gets inherited by whoever wins the next election, not just the party that happened to build it. That's the essence of McConnell's caution, and it's a version of an argument that's shown up repeatedly throughout American political history whenever one party has tried to reshape the rules while it happened to hold power. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska has a very different, far more practical objection. In her state, roughly 1 in 5 residents live outside the road system entirely. For those voters, requiring in-person documentation could mean boarding a plane just to hand over a birth certificate. She's argued publicly that implementation details genuinely matter and deserve real scrutiny rather than getting waved away for the sake of political momentum. It's worth pausing on just how different Alaska's geography is from most of the country. There are towns and villages there that simply don't connect to any road network at all, reachable only by small aircraft or boat depending on the season. A voting law written with the assumptions of a typical mainland state in mind can create genuinely unworkable situations in places like that, regardless of anyone's intentions. Tom Tillis of North Carolina has been the most direct of the 4, stating plainly that he intends to prevent the bill from advancing and warning that changing voting rules this close to a major election risks creating chaos across multiple states. And Susan Collins of Maine The senator, whose vote eventually shifted the math, had drawn her own line early on. She said publicly, back in February, that she supported the substance of the House-passed bill, but she also said clearly that she would not vote to eliminate the legislative filibuster to get it passed. Keep that specific distinction in mind, because it becomes the central paradox of this entire story. Republican leadership didn't just accept the blockade quietly. They tried multiple times to break through it. In March, a procedural vote to open debate on the bill got 51 votes, with only Murkowski among Republicans voting no. 51 isn't 60, so the effort stalled there. In April, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana tried attaching the bill's core provisions to a budget package, hoping to use a process that only requires a simple majority. That attempt failed 48 to 50, with all 4 Republican holdouts voting no, and even if that vote had succeeded, there was another obstacle waiting. The senator, budget reconciliation bills are governed by a rule preventing non-budgetary items from being included publicly, and the Senate's own parliamentarian, she supported the substance of the House core provisions didn't qualify. She also said clearly that she would not vote before it ever really opened. Legislative filibuster. It's worth understanding why senators kept trying the reconciliation route at all, given that closed door, because it becomes the central paradox. Reconciliation is attractive precisely because it only needs Republican leadership didn't just accept the blockade quietly, tempting for any majority party trying to break through it. Legislation that can't clear the vote to open debate on the bill got 51 votes, but with reconciliation was designed narrowly, no, specifically for budget-related matters. 60, so the effort to stall the Senate's nonpartisan parliamentarian. In April, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana tried to attach the bill's core provisions to a budget package, definition, hoping to use a process when that ruling goes against you. There's no real appeal process. That attempt failed 48 to 50, with all 4 Republican holdouts voting no. By early June, the bill had been passed twice by the House, 48 to 50, blocked twice in the Senate, holdouts ruled ineligible for the reconciliation shortcut, and publicly declared dead by Democratic leadership. Almost nobody watching closely expected the situation to change, which is exactly why the night of June 5th caught so much attention when it did. There were 2 separate sources of pressure building underneath the surface in the weeks leading up to that vote. The first came from within the Republican base itself, where the 4 holdouts faced growing public criticism for blocking a bill the party's own voters had been told was a top priority. The second came directly from the president, whose public comments repeatedly tied election integrity concerns to slow ballot counting in states like California, adding fresh political urgency to an already tense standoff, even though election officials note that delayed counts in states like California are typically a routine feature of how mail ballots get processed rather than evidence of anything improper. That second point deserves a little more context because it shaped the emotional temperature of the entire fight heading into June. When a sitting president publicly frames a state's routine ballot counting timeline as suspicious without offering supporting evidence, that framing tends to spread quickly through supportive media and social platforms, regardless of whether election officials on the ground consider anything unusual to actually be happening. That gap between the public narrative and the administrative reality is itself part of the story worth understanding here. Against that backdrop, the Senate entered a marathon overnight session on June 4th into June 5th, tied to a large immigration enforcement funding package. Lawmakers cycled through amendment after amendment for hours. Buried inside that session, Republicans made 2 separate attempts to attach the bill's provisions. The first, led by Senator Lindsey Graham, included additional add-ons and failed 48 to 50, with the same 4 Republicans voting no. Hours later, Senator Mike Lee tried again with a stripped-down version matching the original House-passed text exactly. No additions, no extra provisions. This time, Susan Collins crossed over and voted yes. The motion reached 50 votes in favor, recorded officially just before midnight on June 5th. Technically, because the vote required 60 under budget rules, it still failed. But the number itself, 50 real votes on the record, was something this bill had never achieved before. Try to picture the mechanics of that specific night. Senators shuffling in and out of the chamber for hours, tracking amendment after amendment through a process most viewers never watch closely because it rarely produces a dramatic headline. Then, just before midnight, one senator's position shifts on one specific version of the text, and a number that had been stuck at 48 for months suddenly becomes 50. It's easy to miss how much weight that kind of small, late-night procedural shift can carry once people start looking closely at what it actually means for everything that comes next. Most legislative history doesn't get made in a single dramatic speech or a packed gallery full of cameras. More often, it gets made exactly like this, quietly, after midnight, in a vote most of the country was already asleep for. Mike Lee summed up the moment plainly on social media while the vote was still being counted, arguing that if not for the procedural hurdle still standing in the way, the House-passed bill would already be heading toward the president's desk. That statement captures the real shift accurately. The obstacle was no longer a lack of support. The obstacle had become entirely about process. So why did Collins switch her vote on this particular attempt after voting no on Graham's version just an hour earlier? Her own comments suggest the distinction was about substance, not a change of heart on the underlying policy. She had already said back in February that she supported the House-passed language itself. Her objection to Graham's version appears tied to the additional provisions bundled into it, not the citizenship and photo ID requirements at its core. It's also worth being honest about the political backdrop. Collins is currently running for re-election in one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country, and votes like this one carry real consequences with an energized base watching every roll call closely. This is where the story hands us a real paradox worth sitting with. Susan Collins is the senator whose vote proved a majority exists to support this bill's core provisions. She is also a senator who has spent years publicly defending the legislative filibuster and has said clearly that she won't vote to eliminate it, even for a bill she personally supports. In other words, the same person who delivered the 50th vote also stands as one of the most reliable votes against removing the very procedural wall still blocking that bill from becoming law. Think about what that actually means for anyone hoping this bill eventually passes through eliminating the filibuster outright. The math genuinely doesn't work without her, because Republicans hold exactly 53 seats, and losing even one more vote on a filibuster change makes the whole strategy collapse. Collins isn't just one obstacle among several here. On the question of changing the rule itself, rather than the underlying policy, she may be the single most important vote in the entire chamber, and right now she's on record saying no to that specific change. Democrats, for their part, argue that this entire push represents a serious overreach dressed up as election security. Voting rights organizations and Democratic lawmakers point to research suggesting that millions of eligible citizens, particularly older voters, rural residents, and married women whose current legal name doesn't match the name on their birth certificate, could face real practical barriers under a strict documentation requirement. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia publicly called the effort a direct attempt at voter suppression following the June 5th Idée Distintuac vote. Supporters counter that requiring proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections is a basic, reasonable standard that most Americans already assume exists, and they argue that immediate implementation is necessary precisely because they view the timing before a major election as urgent rather than reckless. There's a genuine factual dispute buried underneath the political rhetoric here too, and it's worth naming plainly. Voting by non-citizens in federal elections is already illegal under existing law, and multiple independent studies examining past elections have found it to be exceptionally rare when it does occur. Supporters of this bill argue that rarity doesn't mean the risk isn't worth closing off entirely, especially as a matter of public confidence in the system. Critics argue that solving an extremely rare problem with a nationwide documentation mandate risks creating a much larger, much more common problem, specifically eligible citizens who simply don't have quick access to the exact paperwork now being required of them. Both of those claims can be factually accurate at the same time, which is part of why this debate tends to generate more heat than clarity. Both sides are arguing from real, sincerely held positions, and this piece isn't going to pretend one side has a monopoly on good faith here. That's genuinely a debate voters deserve to weigh for themselves. If you want the plain, unspun version of exactly how this fight develops from here, subscribe now, because the procedural maneuvering ahead is going to move fast, and headlines alone won't capture what's actually happening inside that chamber. So where does this actually stand today, and where does it go from here? As of right now, heading into the traditional August recess, the bill still has not passed. Majority Leader John Thune has said publicly that Republicans currently don't have the votes to force it through using the reconciliation shortcut, and he has shown no urgency to bring the bill back to the floor before senators leave Washington for the break. The president has publicly pushed for the Senate to cancel its August recess entirely until the bill passes, a request Thune has so far declined to fully embrace. Meanwhile, Senator Tom Tillis, one of the four original holdouts, has stated flatly that the bill is dead for the foreseeable future unless Republicans do the work required to actually reach 60 votes, calling continued efforts around it largely theater at this point. Democratic leadership has been equally blunt, insisting publicly that the bill will not pass now or ever under current Senate rules. Notice how differently these two sides are framing the exact same set of facts. One side points to the 50-vote night as proof that momentum is real and the finish line is finally in sight. The other side points to the fact that weeks later, nothing has actually passed, and treats that same 50-vote night as evidence that the effort has already peaked and started fading. Both framings are technically consistent with the available facts. Neither one fully captures where things genuinely stand, which is somewhere in between. A real, documented shift in the numbers, sitting alongside a real, unresolved procedural stalemate that hasn't gone anywhere since. That tension points toward two genuinely different paths forward, and both run directly through Majority Leader Thune's decisions. The first path involves eliminating the legislative filibuster entirely for this kind of legislation, the same way it was eliminated for nominations and Supreme Court confirmations in the past. The president has pushed for exactly this repeatedly. But Republicans remain divided on the strategy, partly out of concern that a future Democratic majority could use that same precedent against them on entirely different legislation down the road. And here's where the paradox resurfaces directly. Susan Collins, the senator who delivered vote number 50, has been one of the most consistent Republican voices opposing exactly this kind of rule change. The second path involves forcing what's sometimes called a talking filibuster, requiring opponents to actually hold the floor with sustained speech the way Thurman did back in 1957, rather than simply invoking the rule from behind a desk. Some conservative senators have pushed for exactly this approach, betting that sustained public pressure and visible effort might eventually break Democratic resolve. Thune himself has expressed hesitation about this option too, reportedly worried that a drawn-out floor fight could tie up the Senate's calendar for weeks without any guarantee of success, and that Republican unity might not hold firm through an extended standoff involving a flood of hostile amendments. There's a third possibility worth mentioning too, even though it gets less attention than the first two. Some Republicans have floated attaching narrower, more targeted pieces of this agenda, like funding for helping states issue compliant identification documents, to future budget bills that might more clearly satisfy the reconciliation rules the parliamentarian enforces. That approach wouldn't deliver the full bill supporters ultimately want, but it could deliver a partial, incremental version without needing to touch the filibuster at all. Whether that kind of piecemeal strategy satisfies anyone on either side of this fight remains genuinely unclear. Zoom out further, and the political map adds another layer worth understanding. Two of the four original Republican holdouts, McConnell and Tillis, have already announced they won't seek re-election, meaning their opposition becomes less relevant to future votes regardless of how this current fight resolves. Collins has already shown she'll support a clean version of the bill's core language. That leaves Murkowski as the only one of the four still planning to serve in the next Congress while maintaining consistent opposition. And she isn't up for re-election this cycle, meaning near-term pressure on her specific vote is limited. Whether this bill's fate ultimately gets decided by procedural maneuvering this year, or by whichever party controls the Senate after November's midterms, remains genuinely open. Consider how much can shift in the Senate over just one election cycle. If Republicans expand their majority in November and replace McConnell and Tillis with senators more willing to support this bill and change the underlying procedure blocking it, the entire calculation resets without needing anyone currently serving to change their mind at all. If Democrats instead gain ground, the opposite happens, and this specific fight likely fades from the spotlight entirely for at least a couple of years, at least in its current form. That's part of why both sides are treating this November's midterms as consequential well beyond the usual stakes of any single election cycle. And it's part of why a bill this contested keeps colliding directly with the timing of the very elections it would govern. What can be said clearly without spin in either direction is this. For most of this year, officials on one side insisted the votes to support this bill's core provisions simply didn't exist and never would. On the night of June 5th, that specific claim stopped being true. 50 senators, plus a vice president willing to break a tie, is a real documented number. Whatever else remains unresolved about procedure, politics, and the months still ahead before any of this reaches a president's desk. It's worth being precise about what that number does and doesn't prove, since precision tends to get lost the moment a story like this turns into a headline. 50 votes proves that a majority of sitting senators are willing to say yes to the core language of this bill in some form. It does not prove that bill will actually become law this year, and it does not resolve any of the underlying disagreements about whether its requirements are reasonable or overly burdensome. Those two things, the vote count and the actual outcome, are related but genuinely separate questions, and conflating them is exactly how a technically accurate number turns into a misleading headline. Here's what deserves genuine, careful thought as the story keeps developing. This isn't simply a story about one piece of legislation succeeding or failing. It's a live demonstration of how quietly the rules governing American lawmaking can shift, and how much of that shifting happens in overnight sessions most people never see unfold in real time. The filibuster itself isn't dead, whatever a punchy headline might suggest. It's still standing, still functioning exactly as designed, still requiring 60 votes that don't currently exist for this bill. But something around it has genuinely changed. For the first time, there's a real countable majority on record, and that number doesn't simply disappear once the news cycle moves on to the next story. Whichever side of this debate you find yourself on, and there are thoughtful, sincere arguments being made on both sides about what fair, secure, and accessible elections should actually look like, it's worth understanding the mechanics clearly rather than just absorbing whichever framing happens to reach your feed first. Procedural fights like this one rarely make for exciting headlines, while they're unfolding slowly across months, but they quietly decide enormous outcomes, sometimes long before most people are paying close enough attention to notice the shift actually happening. That's really the through line worth remembering here. Most Americans never watch a live cloture vote or a budget point of order get raised on the Senate floor, and there's no real reason they should have to in order to live their daily lives. But the outcome of fights exactly like this one quietly shapes what documents you'll need in hand the next time you walk into a polling place, how quickly a new voting requirement might apply to an election that's already close on the calendar, and how much power any future Senate majority of either party will have to reshape election rules again down the road using the same tools being tested right now. None of that requires anyone to watch every overnight session live. It just requires understanding clearly and honestly what actually happened once the votes were finally counted. The story isn't finished, and the next few weeks around that August recess decision could genuinely reshape where things go from here. If you want the next update explained clearly, without the shouting, subscribe and stick around, because whatever happens next in that chamber is going to matter for a long time after the cameras stop paying attention.